Yeah.
Week 8, you have some major shoes to fill. Welcome back to the Gridiron Expert, bringing you some of the best college football news, predictions, and analysis. Make sure to like this video and check out everything we have in the description below, where you can go visit our official website and also follow us on Twitter, where you can receive more college football news and analysis. Well, guys, as we've been saying all week long, Week 7 was the best week of college football we have had all season. It was the most exciting. It had the best matchups. It had some crazy upsets. And it's going to be very difficult for Week 8 to replicate that success. It's going to be very difficult for Week 8 to live up to that hype and fill the shoes that Week 7 left us going into this next week of college football. Outside of the top 3 ranked versus ranked matchups we did find it pretty difficult to find 2 more games to put up on our top 5 biggest games of Week 8. But don't worry, we're still going to give you some solid analysis for these 5. It's still going to be a great week of college football, and just get through Week 8. Because when Week 9 rolls around, I'm going to put my money down and say it's going to be even better than Week 7. But first, we have to talk about the games ahead, the games that are coming up this week. And we'll kick things off with number 9 Florida traveling to Williams-Brice Stadium to take on South Carolina. And had South Carolina not upset Georgia in what could have been the upset of the year, then I don't think this game would be up here. Because both teams are coming off a loss, both Florida's coming off a loss, South Carolina's coming off a very major win over Georgia. And we'll start with the Gators, who are giving a 60% chance to win this game from the FPI. And I'm going to say I think that's pretty high. I think 60% is pretty high for the Gators here, who gave LSU a great test down in Death Valley. Kyle Trask threw for 310 yards and 3 touchdowns, probably the best performance of his career in a very difficult environment against a very difficult defense. So put up some solid numbers, but Florida still lost 42-28 in Death Valley. Last year, now I know circumstances are different. I know the South Carolina team was different. I know Florida was different. But Florida trailed South Carolina 31-14 in the Swamp before battling back and winning that game 35-31. So 60% to me is rather high considering what South Carolina just did to Georgia and what South Carolina nearly did to Florida last season. Now, the key for Florida is, of course, their defense. That's what they've relied on all season. Kyle Trask finally finding his groove, really looking good at quarterback, better than Felipe Franks in my opinion, but their defense only allows 14.1 points per game and only allows 110.9 rushing yards per game. If you look at South Carolina, Ryan Helinski should be back for this game after getting hurt in the third quarter against Georgia. Their defense and their rushing game was kind of their strength against the Bulldogs, kind of wore them down, defense more than anything, forcing 4 turnovers against Jake Fromm, one of those being a crucial pick 6 and a 3-point victory in double overtime. The key for South Carolina, though, and the bad thing for them, is that they only mustered 24 points one time this entire season. More than 24 points one time this season. And that came in a 72-10 win over Charleston Southern. They're averaging just 25.8 points per game, and they allow 259 passing yards per game. Back in the preseason, I picked South Carolina to pull off this upset, but some circumstances have changed, and even though South Carolina came off such a huge win over Georgia, I'm picking Florida to come on the road and get the win over South Carolina. I don't think they have a letdown game. Both teams could be in for a letdown game. Florida hung over after LSU, South Carolina high after the win over Georgia, but I like the Gators and Dan Mullen to bounce back with their college football playoff and SEC title hopes still intact, thanks to the Gamecocks. Moving down, we have number 12 Oregon taking on number 25 Washington, the biggest game in the Pac-12 this week, or one of the 2 biggest games because we do have Arizona State and Utah. In both of those games, huge because Oregon and Washington, huge for the Pac-12 North, while you have Arizona State and Utah, huge for the Pac-12 South. Between the Ducks and the Huskies, it's kind of been a back-and-forth affair in recent years. The last time these 2 teams met in Seattle, Washington won 38-3. Over a Ducks team that at that time was just 5-5. Last year, though, was an absolute thriller. Both teams trying to find some college football playoff momentum, maybe trying to show that they're contenders. Washington more so than Oregon, but Oregon escaped with the win in Eugene, winning 30-27 in overtime. Oregon is the Pac-12's best hope of getting into the college football playoff. So if you are just a guy that likes to root for the Pac-12, you need to root for Oregon in this game. Because if the Ducks lose, the Pac-12 will not get into the college football playoff. And I know we've got Utah up here at number 13, but I just don't think Utah's going to be able to run the table. Oregon can. They've won 5 straight since they lost to Auburn in the season opener. Justin Herbert, a guy that people aren't talking about enough, over 1,600 yards and 17 touchdowns this season with just 1 interception. The offense is averaging 36 points per game, and they allow just 267.7 yards per game. Not passing yards or rushing yards, total 267.7. So under 270 yards per game allowed against all of their competition this season. They have beaten Stanford, they have beaten California, both of who beat Washington this season. So Washington's playoff hopes are done, even with a win at home over the Ducks. And like I mentioned, Oregon has a very good chance at winning out this year because their toughest remaining games are at USC and at Arizona State. If they get past both of those and win the Pac-12, there is a very good chance that Oregon can slip into the college football playoff. Washington, on the other hand, we mentioned how disappointing the start of the season has been for them. They had that early loss to California, then they had that upset loss to Stanford. So any slim hopes they had of maybe crashing the playoff or maybe winning the Pac-12 ended with that loss to Stanford just a few weeks ago. They're coming off a 24-point win over Arizona on the road, an impressive win. Arizona not a bad team, especially out in the desert. It's a very difficult place to play. Jacob Eason putting up some big-time numbers, over 1,600 yards, almost 1,700 this season. 13 touchdowns and 3 interceptions, leading the offense that has 36.4 points per game. Now, back in the preseason, I like to go back and look at what we were thinking back in the summer and to see if our thoughts have changed as we've watched teams progress through the real college football season. Back in the preseason, we did pick Washington to win this game, and we are sticking with that. This is probably going to be the toughest defense that Oregon has faced since they faced off against Auburn way back in week 1. And even then, I didn't think Auburn's defense looked that great. Chris Peterson wakes up for the big games. In Seattle, mid-afternoon on a Saturday, a Washington defense that's getting better every week, in my opinion. I know they struggled against Cal. I know they struggled against Stanford, but looked good against Arizona. And I think Chris Peterson has his team ready to go. I think Jacob Eason puts up some big numbers through the air against this Oregon defense. That's playing extremely well, but once again, hasn't really been tested as much since that game against Auburn. I think Washington wins this game at home, and the Pac-12 college football playoff hopes are ruined, except for maybe Utah if they can carry the rest of the conference. So the third game we have up here was one that we kind of struggled with. Didn't know if we wanted to put it up here or not, but we went with it. Number 18, Baylor, traveling to Oklahoma State, Boone-Pickens Stadium. Baylor, guys, is one of the biggest surprise teams in all of college football this season. I don't think anybody saw Baylor sitting at 6-0 right now. The way they are playing. Now, the first 3, we know, were easy games, cupcake teams. They had Iowa. They beat Iowa State. They went on the road and annihilated Kansas State, an impressive victory, and then took down, of course, Texas Tech just last week in double overtime. Both those games between Iowa State and Texas Tech, thrillers if you're a Bear fan. They are absolutely Big 12 title contenders, and for some, maybe college football playoff contenders. They still have to play Oklahoma and Texas, both of those back-to-back in November. But the Bears, led by Charlie Brewer, who has thrown for over 1,500 yards, 11 touchdowns, and unfortunately, through his first, second, and third interceptions against Texas Tech last week, is still playing like one of the better quarterbacks in the conference. They have a very balanced offense. Matt Rule doing a phenomenal job with that. 276 passing yards a game, 199 rushing yards per game. So this Baylor's offense is very, very difficult to stop. And their defense has stepped it up more so than they have in years past. Only 17.8 points per game allowed. The key in this game, though, is going to be how their rushing defense will fare against Chuba Hubbard at Oklahoma State. Baylor is only allowing 113.5 rushing yards per game. Oklahoma State is averaging 279 rushing yards per game. As we all know, led by Chuba Hubbard, the nation's leading rusher with 1,094 yards and 13 touchdowns. Baylor has been very impressive as of late, but the schedule is about to get really tough. Oklahoma State on the road. You've got TCU coming up. You've got Oklahoma. You got Texas. This back half of the schedule will show whether Baylor is legit or not. But I do think they take their first loss of the season on the road at Oklahoma State, a team that will pound them on the ground, a team that's coming off a bye week, well rested, and a team that even if Baylor shuts down Chuba Hubbard, has Spencer Sanders and Tylan Wallace in the passing game. This offense will be too much for Baylor to handle, and they drop their first game of the season at Oklahoma State. The second biggest Pac-12 game we have up here on the board, we mentioned Oregon and Washington, big for the North. Arizona State, Utah, big for the South. Arizona State, like Baylor, one of the bigger surprise teams in all of college football this season. 5-1 this season. Should have been 6-0. They dropped a 3-point loss to Colorado at home a few weeks ago. Not looking too good now for the Sun Devils, but had they won that, they would be much higher than number 17 right now, and would be looking like maybe college football playoff contenders themselves. But you know I love Herm Edwards. You know I love the job that he's doing, and what a job he's done, putting them at 5-1, beating Michigan State and beating California, both on the road, I should add, and then last week taking down Washington State in the final seconds. Jaden Daniels came in as a true freshman, and not many people expected much out of him. More people expected Benjamin to carry the load for the Sun Devils offense. Well, it's been quite the opposite. Benjamin's only averaging 4.2 yards per carry, while Jaden Daniels has shown that he's extremely mobile and has thrown for over 1,600 yards, 8 touchdowns, and just 1 interception. They're allowing 91.7 rushing yards per game, 17.7 points per game allowed per game as well. So not too bad across the board. Herm Edwards doing a phenomenal job out in the desert. But that one number that you need to circle is the 91.7 yards per game allowed on the ground. That's big because Utah has this guy named Zach Moss, one of the better running backs in the entire country, that's averaging 228 rushing yards per game as a team. Zach Moss averaging 7.5 yards per carry. So back in the preseason, we thought it'd be a great running back battle between Benjamin and Zach Moss, and now it's really going to be Jaden Daniels versus Zach Moss and his quarterback in Tyler Huntley. And that's one thing that you have to keep in mind as well, how balanced this Utah offense is. Zach Moss carries the load, but they are still averaging over 230 passing yards per game and about 230 rushing yards per game as well. So the offense is about as balanced as you can get for Kyle Whittingham and the Utes. This defense, guys, is the real deal. Utah's defense, we said back in the preseason, is the best in the Pac-12 and could be considered one of the best in the entire nation. And I'm sticking by that. The team's only allowing 13.2 points per game and a little over 50 rushing yards per game. They make Arizona State one-dimensional, force a true freshman quarterback to come into Salt Lake City and win the game practically by himself. I do not think Arizona State is capable of doing that. Utah at home wins and continues to strive for a Pac-12 title and to keep their college football playoff hopes alive. And it should be added that I personally believe that the game day crew, Lee, Kirk, everybody like that, should have been going to Salt Lake City and not Happy Valley for number 16 Michigan at number 7 Penn State. Now, nothing against Happy Valley and Penn State. This was a game that I personally wanted to go to this season. Wasn't able to make it happen. But when you look at the history between Michigan and Penn State, and obviously the stakes that are there for this game and the stakes that are there for Arizona State and Utah, I think Salt Lake City has bigger implications and will be a better game than what's going to happen on Saturday night in Happy Valley. Because Michigan and Penn State have traded blowouts the past few years. They have annihilated each other. We haven't had a one-possession game between Michigan and Penn State since 2014, when Michigan won 18-13. Since then, in 2016, Michigan won 49-10. 2017, Penn State won in Happy Valley 42-13. And last year, back in Ann Arbor, Michigan won 42-7. If history is any indication, Penn State will annihilate Michigan on Saturday night. Now, Michigan, we'll talk about why maybe they can get away from that and what we eventually think is going to happen. But Michigan has struggled offensively, majorly. They're averaging over 30 points per game, and people will say, well, that doesn't sound like they're struggling. Well, those stats are skewed because they have beaten Rutgers by 52 and then dropped 42 or 40 points on Middle Tennessee. Outside of that, they really haven't done much offensively. They're only averaging 231 passing yards a game and 156 rushing yards per game. The defense is what has kind of carried Michigan, was huge in their win over Iowa, was huge in their win over Army, even though that game was much closer than it should have been. But their defense nearly allowed Illinois to come back and beat the Wolverines last week. Michigan got up 28-0 before allowing 25 unanswered points. They found themselves up just 3 points before getting 2 late touchdowns to win 42-25. Penn State, on the other hand, is quite the opposite. They average 42 points per game, 8.2 points per game allowed defensively. Penn State is number 7 for a reason, and it looked like an absolute college football playoff contender and looked like a Big Ten title contender more so than Michigan did. And I don't think many people expected Penn State to be looking this good, especially after everybody they lost in the offseason. But they are coming off their biggest win of the season on the road at Kinnick Stadium. Winning at night over the Hawkeyes, a very difficult thing to do, escaping by just 5 points, and they're only allowing 53.8 rushing yards per game. With Michigan's offensive struggles, if Penn State shuts down the run and forces Shea Patterson to win through the air, or if they shut down Shea Patterson and force Michigan to win on the run, either way, Michigan will not be able to put up enough points and get enough offensive firepower going in this game to defeat Penn State. I'm expecting yet another blowout in this game. Penn State takes care of Michigan. Michigan is done for the Big Ten title. They are done for the college football playoff, and they are done with Jim Harbaugh. So those are your top 5 games of Week 8. Hopefully they will pan out and be exciting and as good as we had in Week 7. Although, once again, I'm solely banking on that happening in Week 9. Now, of course, we didn't have our Heisman Watch up here. We're taking a short break from that. The Heisman Watch will return when we do our Week 9 predictions. Obviously, plenty of big games coming your way, so you don't want to miss that, and you don't want to miss our analysis on some of the top players in the entire country. But your 5 biggest games going into Week 8, who we have winning, of course, it's college football, and as we all know, anything can happen. So, make sure you watch these 5. Wait for our Game of the Week analysis coming out the rest of this week. I can promise you're not going to want to miss that. Sign up for the newsletter, sign up for the expert picks, and follow us on Twitter at Gridiron Expert. And as always, thank you for watching. Please continue to like, comment, and subscribe. And we'll see you next time on the Gridiron Expert.